No army invaded. No country surrendered. Yet one currency ended up ruling the world. This is how the dollar conquered nations, without firing a single bullet. Most people believe power comes from armies, borders, or flags. But the real power, the kind that controls nations silently, invisibly, without anyone noticing, lies in money. And no currency in history has wielded that power more effectively than the US dollar. From everyday transactions to international trade, from political influence to economic control, the dollar has quietly shaped the world in ways armies never could. To understand this quiet conquest, we must go back to a world torn apart by war. In 1944, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were leveled, economies shattered, and nations desperate for stability. The United States, however, emerged largely unscathed. Its factories still operated, its gold reserves were full, and its economy was booming. The world needed a new anchor, a new system that could restore trust in money. Enter Bretton Woods. Representatives from 44 countries gathered in a small New Hampshire town to craft a new global financial order. Officially, the aim was reconstruction and economic stability. Unofficially, it was the moment the dollar began its quiet march toward global dominance. The agreement was deceptively simple. Other currencies would tie themselves to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be convertible to gold. In theory, it was a cooperative framework. In practice, it handed the United States unprecedented financial power, control over global trade, without ever conquering a territory. The immediate effects were subtle but profound. Countries began storing dollars in their reserves. International contracts were increasingly priced in dollars, and trade became dependent on this single currency. Oil, food, gold, shipping, everything was suddenly measured in dollars. Over time, the dollar became the world's lingua franca of money. By the 1970s, even when the gold standard ended, the dollar retained its supremacy. Petrodollars flowed, global debt was priced in dollars, and nations scrambled to hold this green paper as a symbol of security. Every crisis, every boom, every political maneuver in the modern world had the dollar at its center. And yet, few stopped to realize how deeply it controlled their economies and, indirectly, their governments. The quiet conquest of the dollar is not just about money, it's about influence. Nations that once wielded sovereign power now found themselves dependent on U.S. economic policies. Trade wars, sanctions, and financial aid became instruments of soft power, tools that shaped behavior without firing a single shot. Countries adapted, conformed, and sometimes collapsed, all under the subtle authority of this single currency. Consider Japan in the 1980s. The yen was strong, but Japanese businesses still relied heavily on the dollar for international trade. Oil crises, imported goods, and global finance were all measured in greenbacks. Or think of Latin America, where decades of dollar-denominated debt meant that a rise in U.S. interest rates could trigger national crises thousands of miles away. Countries that tried to resist the dollar often paid the price, sometimes in economic turmoil, sometimes in political instability. Even modern crises, like the 2008 global financial meltdown, were filtered through the dollar. Banks in New York and Washington controlled liquidity, and when the Federal Reserve acted, the effects rippled across every continent. Nations with weaker economies found themselves forced to follow U.S. policy, sometimes against their own interests. The dollar had become a silent ruler, influencing lives without ever needing armies or borders. The dollar's reach is everywhere, from the tiniest island nation to the largest economies. Almost every country relies on its stability. When the dollar strengthens, emerging markets struggle to pay off debts. When it weakens, global prices spike. Investors, governments, and ordinary citizens all live under its invisible rule, often without realizing how dependent they have become. The quiet dominance of the dollar also allowed the United States to wield geopolitical power in ways no empire had achieved before. Sanctions, aid packages, trade agreements, they became weapons of influence. Countries like Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea felt the weight of the dollar without any direct military engagement. By controlling access to the currency that fuels global trade, the U.S. could bend entire economies to its will, while the rest of the world followed the invisible rules of a monetary empire. Even in times of crisis, the dollar's supremacy persists. Consider the COVID-19 pandemic. Trillions of dollars in stimulus flowed through the U.S. banking system, affecting global liquidity. Central banks across the world scrambled to maintain reserves in dollars, fearing that disruption in the greenback could ripple through their own economies. This invisible control, calm, silent, yet absolute, defines the power of the dollar. Some might wonder, what happens when this empire itself becomes unstable? Signs of stress are everywhere. Debt levels, inflation, political polarization, and economic bubbles threaten the stability of the very currency that rules the world. Yet even in moments of crisis, the dollar's central role persists. Nations scramble to secure it, traders panic over its value, and governments realign strategies to accommodate its influence. The empire is fragile, but it is also nearly impossible to replace. History teaches a simple truth. Empires that rule silently through money are the most enduring. Unlike empires built on conquest, their power is not limited by borders, troops, or weapons. It flows through every bank, every transaction, every trade, and every contract. It shapes policy, directs markets, and defines the rules of survival for billions of people across continents. And the dollar, quietly, has achieved all of this. The story of the dollar is also a warning. Power that is invisible is often taken for granted. And when the foundation of that power shifts, the consequences can be catastrophic. Nations dependent on the dollar are vulnerable to forces far beyond their control. Political decisions, natural disasters, financial miscalculations, they all become amplified in a system where one currency dominates everything. Consider countries like Argentina or Turkey, whose histories have been repeatedly shaped by sudden shifts in dollar exchange rates. Entire populations experience inflation, unemployment, and poverty, triggered by changes they cannot control. Even the richest nations feel it. Global trade disruptions, energy prices, and financial markets all respond to the dollar's movements. Yet, despite the risks, the world remains dependent. Emerging economies seek access to dollar reserves. Corporations price contracts in dollars. Oil, food, and goods are traded in greenbacks. Even alternative currencies struggle to gain traction against a system built over decades of trust, inertia, and global reliance. The conquest of the dollar is a story of strategy, patience, and silent influence. It is a story of a currency that became an empire without a single battlefield. It is a reminder that power does not always roar. It sometimes whispers, invisibly, yet shapes the destiny of billions. As we move further into the 21st century, the question becomes inevitable. Will any currency ever challenge this silent empire? Or has the dollar already conquered the modern world forever? History has already answered part of the question. The dollar's empire is built not on fear or force, but on trust, necessity, and global dependence. To challenge it would require the coordinated will of nations, something history has rarely seen. For now, the dollar continues its quiet conquest. And while empires of the past fell with cannons and bloodshed, this empire thrives in silence, in ledgers, in digital transfers, and in the very foundation of global trade. Every decision, every deal, every economic fluctuation resonates through the world, reminding us that the most powerful empire of all is paper and trust. The dollar did not conquer the world with armies, tanks, or missiles. It conquered it quietly, invisibly, in ways no empire in history ever could. It controls trade, influences governments, dictates crises, and shapes the lives of billions, without a single shot being fired. Its empire is built on trust, dependence, and silence. And while some may hope for an alternative, the world remains bound by the rules it quietly sets. But here's the lesson. Power that whispers is often more dangerous than power that roars. Nations, corporations, and even individuals must recognize this quiet dominance, because ignorance is the only way it continues unchecked. History has already shown what happens when invisible power goes unnoticed. If this story has made you stop and think, it's time to act. Like this video to spread awareness. Subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Comment below. Do you think any currency can challenge the dollar, or is it destined to remain the silent empire forever? Because the dollar doesn't ask permission to influence the world, it simply does. And the only choice we have is whether to understand it before it shapes the next century of our lives.